Hello everybody and welcome back to Weeb Revolution with me, the apparently resident queer voice of the channel, M&M. As you can tell from the title, we're gonna be looking at the representation of polyamory, but really lack thereof. An attempt to answer questions that have been gnawing on me personally, and hopefully on you as well. Now, to give you a little bit of a background on what even prompted this wild goose chase, undertaken by yours truly, the call to adventure here was as mundane as you could imagine. My friends told me that I should finally watch the Unlimited Blade Works, one of the only few pieces of Fate/Type Moon/Nasuverse conglomerate in the main series releases that I had yet to see. And the reasons had very little to do with polyamory. They mostly wanted me to do that because they assured me it gives a great deal of development to the main guy, Shiro Emiya, and I've become somewhat notorious for absolutely sizzling hot takes about Fate. In short, I'm extremely cynical when it comes to a property whose explicit premise is what if historical figures but hot anime girls? I've been putting that anime back for years now, and I was finally prompted to watch it specifically on the promise of a polyamorous relationship between Tosaka Rin, Saber, and Shiro. So, to get this out of the way first, UBW is a great anime. Shiro is a good boy who didn't do nothing wrong, Rin is best girl in the Fate franchise, and the whole sorted affair has absolutely nothing to do with polyamory. So I was massively baited, but notably with good intentions. As I was watching UBW, I was explicitly searching for any indicators that there is, in fact, polyamory happening. Something to sink my teeth in that would exist outside of cowardly symbolism or winks and nods towards the much more explicit source material. And what I found was not enough to satisfy me. This is not to say UBW was bad, it's a very good character study. I just came into it with very different expectations. But this prompted a big question. Since UBW wasn't that good poly shit I was hoping to find, where is it? Does my own holy grail exist, or is it, in fact, just a fake chalice overflowing with curses? And just like that, my quest had begun. Part 1. Setting the boundaries of the relationship. Now, as any good researcher, which I'm not, but I decided to pretend to be, I had to start by setting the parameters of my research. I couldn't simply dive into anime without having a firm notion of what I'm looking for until I find something that vaguely satisfies me on an emotional level. For one thing, that's not how a researcher ought to conduct themselves. That's how a mystic would approach a vision quest, and I wanted to be thorough. For another, I knew that there's just too much anime in existence. This quest would quickly become infinite as new anime is produced at a faster rate than I'm able to consume it. So we're starting by cutting corners. Some of you may probably be confused already and thinking to yourselves, what's the issue here? Plenty of poly ships exist in anime. What about To Love Ru? What about Hayate no Gotoku? What about Date Alive? And on the raunchier end of the spectrum, what about High School DxD? Here's the thing. For the purposes of this research, I had to exclude all anime that would fall into the harem subgenre. And no, that's not me saying that a harem is not a valid type of a polycule. All poly relationships are valid as long as they're consensual. If you want to be a part of a harem and compete for the attention of the singular, almost completely sexually drained person, knock yourself out. Send me pictures! Or even better, don't. No, the reason I had to remove harems from the equation is very simple. I already knew anime can do harem, and sometimes it can even do it well, maybe, possibly. But that's just the thing, it seemed like anime was only ever capable of producing two types of relationships, a couple and a harem. And 99% of the time with the cis-male audience stand-in as the lead. Wonder why that could be, put a pin in that, we'll get back to it. The very point of my research was to question that notion, to see if within over 3 decades of anime existing as a medium, it managed to do something different, at least once. So for the sake of this project, the only acceptable kind of a poly relationship consists of, at minimum, 3 people, where at least 2 of these people are in contiguous relationships with at least 2 people, who of course can be the same 3 people comprising the polycule. While we're at it, I also had to exclude hentai, because Well, for one thing, it would be difficult to talk about hentai in a video made for YouTube. I shudder to imagine the hoops Calliope would have to jump through while editing this video if I decided to consider it. And for another, hentai is, by definition, very niche, out of scope for the general audience. What I wanted to find was something that could, even if it was very niche, still be considered mainstream. So that's it. Those are the rules, and this is the goal. Find one polyamorous relationship in anime, excluding harem and hentai. If you're still sneering at these constraints, by all means make your own video. One that presumably would be 2 minutes long and consist of you going on My Anime List, typing harem in the search bar, and declaring victory with the first anime you find. I'm sure it's gonna be a banger. The video, I mean, not the anime. Actually, the anime will probably be a banger too, but a very different kind of a banger. Okay, this analogy is drifting away from me. Next part. Part 2. The search. So, with the parameters set, I've begun my quest in earnest, and right off the bat, I ran into a problem. I knew what I was looking for and what to exclude, but how the hell was I even gonna look for it? Had I not simply excluded harem and hentai, I would have been able to at least just dive into anime right away. But with these rules, I had to be selective. Problem is, there is no poly filter on any anime aggregate website. Anime blissfully does not seem to distinguish between different types of relationships. The sites usually just dump everything into a huge romance bucket, which makes searching for specific things very difficult. So I resorted to the obvious, immediate solution that comes to mind when you can't find what you're looking for with a simple Google search. I asked friends. Now, remember, I'm a socialist, and all my friends lean left as well. It would stand to reason that we have similar interests, and they'd be open-minded, but as it turns out, none of them were able to help. In fact, they told me it couldn't be done, that such an anime does not exist, and that this is a mad quest that would produce no results. They did suggest 2 options though: Gundam Iron-Blooded Orphans and Girlfriend. Put a pin in that as well. I decided to ignore these warnings and pushed through though. The next avenue of search was just asking Google, but this also turned out to be something of a bust. I was only able to find old Quora quotes and obscure forum posts from 2017 that didn't have a lot of replies, and when they did, they just suggested harem shows because the people asking the questions weren't precise enough. With almost all options exhausted, I had one way out left. I had to ask myself. So that's what I did. I decided to visit r/anime, the premier gathering of weebs on the internet, to get recommendations. The results were exactly what you'd expect them to be, by which I mean I was immediately called a cuck. There were only 2 people who were even vaguely helpful, and once again the same 2 propositions emerged: Iron-Blooded Orphans and Girlfriend. Of course, they too told me that this quest was crazy and that the anime I'm looking for does not exist. Which made me think. It's crazy that both my socialist friends and the internet weebs, who can only be described as aggressively politically disabled, would share the same opinion about my endeavor. And that these 2 polar opposite groups would suggest the same anime. I asked the user I was engaged in a conversation why they think there is no anime like that, within 3 decades of anime existing. What was their opinion on why anime was seemingly incapable of producing any type of relationship other than a couple and a harem, when every other medium in existence can? What they said etched itself into my soul like a scalding brand. They said, because nobody wants to see the main character get cucked. That simple sentence may seem trivial and obvious. Of course, that's what the weeb on r/anime would say. I expected nothing else. True. And yet, think about it. Because that sentence contains so much inside of it, that person I was talking to is obviously not an expert in all things anime. They haven't seen even the minimum majority of anime. They haven't studied animation, They've likely never been to Japan and barely know a couple of Japanese phrases, if even that. And yet here they are, presenting themselves as an expert, telling me that the anime I'm looking for surely does not exist anywhere. And why? Because nobody wants to see the main character get cucked. So, right off the bat, the immediate assumption here is that the prospective anime protagonist has to be a man, presumably between 16 and 25. He's the center of the storyline from whose sole perspective the events of the plot are observed. And should he develop romantic feelings for one or more characters, he's fully entitled to their sole affection. Anything else would constitute them getting cucked. What's fascinating is that every single junction in this chain of logic could be false. All of them could be false at the same time. The protagonist may not be a man, and may not even be the sole protagonist. They may or may not develop romantic feelings for anyone, and these feelings may or may not be reciprocated. And should they be reciprocated, we must repeat the whole song and dance again for that other character who may already have feelings for a different character, which would not result in anybody getting cucked in a meaningful way. And even if we granted all that for the sake of the argument, and agreed that indeed that poor anime schmuck with short black hair, dull voice and few genuine interests in life is getting cucked, whatever that means, so what? Who is this weeb on r/anime to tell me that truly nobody would want to see that happen? Surely between 8 billion people on this planet, a lot of whom watch anime even if casually just because it's incredibly hard not to, there have to be some people who would find that interesting, who would actually want to see the main character get cucked, whether they identify with that character or not. But this person, this anonymous user, assures me that nobody wants to see the main character get cucked. And you already know why. Because they're not talking about that fictional main character of a non-existent anime. They're talking about themselves. And just like that, I finally realized what I've stumbled upon. Part 3. The taboo. In linguistics, there exists a concept of the taboo. Now, the term itself is not unknown to you, but in this technical field it has a somewhat different usage. Colloquially, the taboo is a subject excluded from polite conversations. Its existence is an open secret, sometimes widely common knowledge, but it's something you do not mention. In linguistics, however, the taboo is stronger. It's an aspect of language that is not acknowledged. The taboo exists entirely in the negative space of language. Usually, a particular taboo doesn't even have a name, or it has several different names without any one being agreed upon. The taboo is a blind spot of perception. Like jazz, it's all about the notes that are not played. This is not to say that nobody is aware of the existence of a taboo. Some may be, and the full scope of it is usually incomplete. In ye olden times of medieval Europe, witchcraft used to be one such taboo. Women known as witches, existing at the fringes of the polite society, would perform vital functions and services that regular people wouldn't engage in. With the spread of Christianity, though, this taboo was given shape and name. It became a receptacle for societal woes, a convenient scapegoat that all the evils of the world could have been blamed upon. The old wisdom of Middle Eastern mystics posits that in order to defeat and bind a demon to your service, you must first learn its name. A fear named and bound in understandable parameters is a fear easily conquered. And the same thing happened to witches with the publication of a widely disseminated and equally infamous text, Maleus Maleficarum, usually translated as Hammer of Witches, although a more accurate translation would be The Witch's Bane. Published in the early 15th century. That piece of literature, if you want to be generous, was, in many ways, the culmination of the Western culture's attempts in the Dark Ages to name and conquer the taboo of witchcraft. I don't have to tell you, of course, but what followed were centuries of religious persecution and murder of people who frequently did not even fit the very narrow bill established socially. Our regular viewers and those with curious disposition will, of course, immediately spot parallels with other minorities, especially sexual and/or political minorities, that frequently find themselves in a very similarly precarious position to the witches of old. A small silver lining to this is that despite the aggressive persecution, witches never really went anywhere, and even as they were being murdered left and right, mostly right, at that very moment they were already experiencing a revival of their own. It was at this point that it became clear to me: polyamory in anime is simply one such taboo. The word for it exists, technically, but it's not widespread enough, and the phenomenon is poorly understood, even though it existed in societies across the world over forever. The current target of modern witch trials seem to be trans people, so the polyamorous witches of the world have not received their Malleus Maleficarum just yet. But with all this said, it is finally time to talk about the two series presented to me as poly. Part 4. Polyamory in anime does not exist. As great as Iron-Blooded Orphans was, I don't have that much to say about it, unfortunately, purely because its romance was barely even a subplot. To its credit, it was handled tastefully well enough, but the main driving force of it, Mikazuki, just does not have enough of an expressive personality to pilot it well. A sad backstory and moral ambiguity are hardly a substitute for character, is what I'm saying. The thing I do have to mention, though, are the shenanigans the studio engaged in when handling the culmination of the three-way romance between Mika, Kudelia, and Atra. It was told to me that, apparently, the creators wanted the series to end with a gay wedding between Atra and Kudelia, post Mikazuki's death, and were shot down, forcing them to throw in an Easter egg of a marriage certificate in the background of the last episode. It is also good that I was told this, because, frankly, without it, I would not have enough to determine that Kudelia and Atra were into each other. And even now, with that knowledge, their marriage seems to me more like an attempt to reconcile the unavoidable death of their mutual boyfriend than a genuine expression of love. It does go a long way in explaining Gundam Witch from Mercury, though, as presumably the creators decided to put their foot down next time and demand a lesbian wedding up front, or no Gundam. Which, if that is the case, props for that. Unfortunately, it's not enough to sway me. But the problem here isn't that IBO isn't poly, it's just that its romance is an afterthought. It exists and ship it to your heart's content, but its subdued presentation is not gonna break any new ground. Ultimately, it's too easy to brush aside, and as it still puts the male insert in the driver's seat, it serves as a power fantasy of the audience to tell them just how cool it would be to have two girlfriends, a childhood friend and a princess, and maybe they would even, do things together for the man's enjoyment. Good steps maybe. Not good enough. Girlfriend, I have more to say about though. The series started out very strong to me, which came as a shock. I did not actually expect it to be so funny and engaging. I have to chalk it up to the presentation of the concept as very novel though. Bear in mind, the presentation, meaning that the anime insists that it's a novel thing, and I was hoodwinked. It is not actually novel at all. The first 3 episodes were hilarious and extremely promising. The presentation of Naoya, our main guy, as this Abe Lincoln-esque figure, the pop cultural mythical one, not the real one, who is physically incapable of lying for selfish reasons, had me in stitches. And the moments of bonding between Nagisa and Saki over gaming or studying were extremely good. Especially so because the anime managed to break a trend. Naoya was not actually the subject of their conversations. They were genuinely trying to get to know each other better. Coupled with Saki's implied bisexuality, this made me very hopeful for the direction of the series. I wanted the conflict to be primarily about the difficulty of these 3 living a domestic life together, which really isn't any different from showing a young couple's early days, except, there is 3 of them. Simple, maybe, but at least actually a little novel. Unfortunately, my hopes were viciously dashed against the rocks with the introduction of Mirika, who forcibly inserted herself into the plot and promptly became a black hole threatening to devour the entire series. I must stress, I don't even hate Mirika. If she existed as a standalone character in another story, she'd probably be one of my favorites. Sure, she's obnoxious in the beginning, but it's that Navi sort of annoying, where you learn to love her over time. She has enough redeeming qualities to be a good character, she's driven and resourceful. But what she represented for the plot of Girlfriend was pure destructive force. It was no longer about the domestic life of these three goofs, it was now about Mirika, and it would stay about Mirika until the very end. The fact that the comedy in the series got worse over time did not help. This anime turned out to have a tendency to drag the build-up of every joke just a little too much for the payoff to be worth it. These things together serve to undermine the very premise of the show as this positive, if rocky, poly relationship. In interviews, the author, Hiroyuki, claimed that the stated goal of the series was to portray a harem where everyone wins. Well, thanks Hiroyuki, but the one person who didn't win here was me. As the story kept progressing, it became less about the simple difficulties of figuring out how to live their lives as three very horny teenagers without hurting each other's feelings, and became about every single person who learned about the relationship of Nagisa, Saki and Naoya trying to dismantle it with extreme prejudice, just out of sheer moral panic. So in essence, what started as a promising poly plot became anti-poly, a tale about how if you try to establish any relationship other than the heteronormative one, literally the entire world is going to descend upon you and try to destroy it. Which, goddamn, fair enough I guess. I dived into this from a tangent about witch trials, and here I am observing an actual witch trial of these fictional characters. So I guess if there's anything I have to say about Girlfriend, it's that, much like its protagonist Naoya, it's painfully honest. I will be watching the second season, probably, just to see if they manage to somehow salvage this. I'm not holding my breath. So, these are the two series that were recommended to me. Something to fulfill the parameters of my search, and how do they stack up? Well, not great. For one thing, both of these stories still put the male audience insert into the protagonist's role, which is inherently suspect. While Girlfriend gave a lot more breathing room to all three members of the relationship, it also quickly forgot about what the driving force of the conflict should even be. For another, there just isn't enough there in either of these series for me to really say that these were poly relationships according to the metrics I established. At the end of the day, these were glorified harems. Maybe a little unique, but to call them genuine would be to show generosity I am not known for. So it seems that my quest was largely a failure. Part 5. Perhaps it's different overseas. All of this is coming from a Western perspective on the issue, of course. With my quest seemingly a failure, I ended up retracing my steps and trying to see if I missed something. It is at this point that I had to lament my own inadequacies, namely the fact that I do not know the Japanese language well enough to look into native sources or to talk to Japanese users to see if they could offer me an alternative. What I did manage to find out though is that apparently polyamory, or rather cheating, is surprisingly common in Japan and considered fairly normal. According to an article written by Alice Preet for The Metropolis, link down below, some 84% of women in Japan consider having multiple male partners to be healthy. The author suggests that the Japanese people simply have a different frame of reference to our Western perspective on the matter. Cheating is normal and expected, just, don't do it in the open. The value of partnerships is in appearances and social perks, not in the basic facet of forming communities. That reminded me of the moment in Girlfriend where Shino confronts Naoya about the arrangement and exclaims that polygamy is illegal in Japan, and he would not be able to get the tax and social benefits associated with marriage. I have to question this framing though, as it lightly smells of exoticism, and it really does not seem that different from the Western view of marriage when you boil it down. We can talk a lot about how to us marriage is about love, but the data does not bear that notion out. It is also worth mentioning that the author derives this idea from the traditional Japanese views on marriage, meaning that a form of polygamy is expected because marriages in Japan happen at a young age. Marriages that are, of course, entirely heterosexual, as Japan seems to go back and forth every couple of months on whether same-sex marriage bans are constitutional or not, which largely seems to depend on the weather at the time, and in effect leads to a simple preservation of the status quo. So even if polyamory is socially acceptable in Japan, which it does not seem to be more so than anywhere in the West, it seems to come down simply to young cis men having the social dispensation to cheat on their partners and young spouses. And maybe sometimes also women being allowed to cheat depending on how much of a pushover the guy is. Funny how that ends up working. It is curious though, that while a person having multiple partners is apparently acceptable in Japan, according to Alice Preet, anime seems to have a wholly different perspective. In anime, that idea is delineated with a dreaded tag that evokes primordial fear in the hearts of young men: netorare. Although, if you wanted to be generous, you could venture an elaborate interpretation where the ending of school days is a cautionary tale of what happens should a prospective young man fail to keep his cheating on the down low. An elaborate interpretation that I would actually have to pause to consider, given how much blood, sweat, and ink has been spilled by Japanese writers, artists, and animators trying to teach their one target demographic to not be the worst degenerates imaginable, only to fail for reasons that seem entirely systemic. Be that as it may, the point is, I genuinely fail to see this as anything other than what it first appears to be. Anime being a product peddled to young boys, which perhaps underwent a significant mutation due to its origins of aping American comic book and cartoon industries, but which nonetheless merely reinforce hegemonic cultural norms of Japan, which at this point in time don't seem that different from the Western norms, however much may they have been borrowed. At the end of the day, there is no polyamory in anime, because nobody wants to see the main character get cucked. Part 6. Breaking the taboo. With all this said, I have to circle back to the witch trials mentioned before. See, the taboo is a curious thing. A fear named is a fear that can be conquered, but it is also something eminently understandable, and things that are understandable tend to lose their fear factor surprisingly quickly. Even as the witches of old were murdered left and right, witchcraft was already experiencing its own revival. By the 17th century, the aesthetic of witches and the ideals of magic and mysticism were an ingrained aspect of the English culture, a culture that would soon come to dominate most of the world. Today, it is not unusual to identify as Wicca and to practice witchcraft without restraint. In many ways, the witch trials were a knee-jerk response to a sharp increase in the popularity of witchcraft and the broadening understanding of it. In reality, all naming a taboo does is give it form, and with form comes visibility. And visibility leads to attention, and that is the only currency you'll ever need in the marketplace of ideas. It stands to reason then that all the knee-jerk reactions to relationship models alternative to the heteronormative standard, the conspicuous absence of polyamory in anime, are a tacit acknowledgement of just how alluring the notion is, even to the reviled straight. If 84% of Japanese women truly consider light cheating to be acceptable, that's 84% of that job already done. So at the end of the day, yes, there is no polyamory in anime, because nobody wants to see the main character get cucked. Or do we? If we really didn't, would such a strong reaction be necessary? You'd think all you'd need was a shrug, and yet here it is. So I'm gonna end on a more hopeful note and say, polyamory does not seem to exist in anime for now. But just as the time came for Bridget, the time may yet come for the poly witches. Thank you for watching.